Today for ADG Pro, we're going back to Star Control 2, one of the most popular game franchises from the days of DOS, still getting updates and remakes to this day. In fact, one of the key details which made it popular was its combat system, first introduced in the original Star Control, where players fight one-on-one from an overhead perspective with very simple rotational controls and buttons for a primary attack and a special attack. The developers of Star Control knew just how addictive their combat system was, and so when they made Star Control 2, they also included an executable for a special Super Melee mode, where players could create teams of ships and just duke it out, either against various skill levels of AI or against a second player. However, ever since I first played this game in the mid-90s, there's been something about the combat, and specifically the Super Melee mode, and it's always bothered me. It's just how well balanced are those ships? I mean, here's the thing, every ship in Super Melee mode has a points value attached to it. This isn't some sort of hard limit by any means, but rather, it's meant to indicate how powerful each ship is relative to every other ship, so that players can balance out their fleets when facing each other if they so desire. But I distinctly remember my friends sometimes decimating my supposedly balanced fleets, and I even remember one day when a friend and I agreed to ban the Kimmer Avatar from our fleets because it was just too OP. So, did I just suck at the game, or was the problem more insidious in that maybe the ships aren't as well balanced as we thought they were? Well, let's figure this out once and for all. To start with, we need to understand what we're getting ourselves into here. Balancing out a fleet of 25 ships as fairly as possible is not going to be an easy task, but we have some help in the form of the AI. The AI has various levels of skill, and at its maximum setting, it actually plays almost as good as a real person. Now, it does have a handful of shortcomings, but certainly not enough that it would have a huge effect on the end result. Plus, players themselves are going to have lapses in judgment when fighting anyways, so we'll just chalk up the margin of error as expected. Now, another feature of this Super Melee mode is that when a battle is over and a combatant brings out their next ship, the state of the other ship and of the surrounding star field does not change. This means any crew lost in a prior battle carries over to the next. Thus, even a fleet of weaker ships can take down a much stronger ship sooner or later, and this in turn makes it way easier to balance everything, as we'd otherwise have to measure remaining crew percentages, and I kind of don't feel like doing that. The other catch, though, is that this isn't going to be even remotely fast. With 25 ships to measure against each other, we're going to need to put them to task in a minimum of 300 battles, and to ensure we get a good balance of possibilities, I've elected to give each side 5 of their respective ships in every battle. This means a minimum of 1,500 rounds of combat. Now, as intimidating a prospect as it is going through all of that, we are using emulation. And with emulation comes the ability to fast forward. So most of my week was spent watching battles go by like this. Yeah, that's not me speeding up the footage, that's me capturing DOSBox using external capture software while holding the Alt F12 fast forward key combination. I can't just leave it sit either, as I have to frequently adjust who's fighting who, and also make sure to properly record the win counts. In fact, here's the blank table I've started with. By the time I'm done, this table is going to be completely filled with win counts. So yeah, that was my life for almost 3 days straight, was watching the AI fight itself for an insane number of battles and recording the final results. Even with fast forwarding, it took somewhere between 16 and 20 hours to test every single combination of ship versus ship. Although I made a point to record some of the more interesting battles, as well as to make note when things were turning out in an interesting or unusual way, in which case I'd start the battle over and record it at normal speed. Now, since there's not really much to say about compiling the final data, let's spend some time analyzing some of these fights. Now, despite going in alphabetical order by race, one of the first fights where I realized I might end up with some very interesting results was with the Androsynth Guardian versus the Korra Marauder. Now, the Guardian was only rated at 15 points in the Super Melee mode, and the Marauder with 30, the highest value in there that's only assigned to 3 ships in total. Now, with stats like that, you'd expect the Marauders to utterly decimate the Guardians. Which they did, but the Guardians put up a considerable fight and still managed to take out 3 of the Marauders before losing their entire fleet of 5. Ultimately, when I finished all of the Androsynth Guardian battles against all other opponents, as they were the first in line, they ended up with a win count total of 101, Now, that's very significant because even if one of these ships manages to get a maximum win count for every battle, that's still only going to total 120 wins. So 101 out of 120 wins means that point value of 15 might be way off. I continued down the list until reaching the Arlu Skiff versus the Supox Blade, only to notice that, well, this is where one of the discrepancies in the AI was causing a bit of a weird outcome, as you can see for yourselves. Now, it's important to note that both of these ships have a point value of 16, yet every time this situation sorted itself out due to asteroids or the gravitational pull of the planet in the battlefield, the Skiff always won. So despite the even point matchup, the Blade was completely shut out here. Again, more evidence that maybe this balancing wasn't perfectly figured out, but there's still a lot more battles to go. The Chimera Avatar was fourth in line, so it didn't take long to get to it and see how truly overpowered it was. In fact, it blew through just about every opponent with little effort, save for 4. It had only a little bit of trouble going up against Druge Maulers, the Korra Marauders, and the Urquan Dreadnoughts, but it actually failed to survive against one and only one opponent: Utwig Juggers. Now, the thing about the Jugger is that it has the ability to absorb attacks, though the power to absorb also drains battery power, and the amount of power absorbed directly relates to how powerful the incoming attack is. So the Jugger is keenly designed to be best suited against powerful enemies, making it the only ship which stood a decent chance against the Avatar. This kind of ties into why balancing in this format is so tricky, though. Now, every ship has such wildly different capabilities that certain ships may be really strong but terrible against a particular kind of ship, while other ships may be relatively weak but well suited versus the kinds of ships the powerful ship had trouble dealing with. In fact, I started to keep in mind by this point that a table of win values might not in and of itself be very useful, but that the resulting data may still have a purpose following, so I kept going. Now, speaking of the Druge Mauler, that was one of only 5 ships the Earthling cruiser had any sort of hope in defeating reasonably well, despite the cruiser having only 11 points compared to the Mauler's 17. The only other ships the cruiser could take on reasonably well were all weaker ships: the Shafixti Scouts, the Thradish Torches, Umga Drones, and Zokfot Pick Stingers. Next up was the Ilrath Avenger, and this ended up becoming another huge upset to the balancing points. Now, it only has 10 points, presumably because of its very short-ranged attack and the fact that its cloaking device doesn't really make it immune to damage. Yet despite this, the Avenger was very good at taking out opponents. Now, heck, when pitted up against the Or's Nemesis, which is normally worth 23 points, the Avenger just absolutely dominated the battle. Though watching the Avenger and Earthling cruisers take each other on was kinda ridiculous. This is another one of those weird instances where the nature of the AI and the ships involved did not lend itself well to a decisive battle, so it kinda just went on like this for far too long. The Korra Marauder proved pretty resilient as well, only really coming up short against other powerful ships. But one ship I was surprised to see it evenly perform against was the Spathi Eluders of all things. The Eluders are very basic ships designed for defense rather than offense, given their high crew count and rear-firing homing missiles. And yet this was enough to bring it on par with the Marauders, despite the Marauders having 30 points and the Eluders only 18. Many of the fights following involving the Melnorm Traders, Murnmurm X-Forms, and Mycon pod ships all went about as expected. Most of the Or's Nemesis fights went as expected too, though I got an interesting surprise once they went up against the Yeehot Terminators, despite both ships having a point value of 23. See, the Terminators have an invulnerability shield, similar to the absorption abilities of the Utwig Juggers, but with slightly different mechanics and limitations. Now, this shield made the Yeehot Terminators exceptionally well suited against most opponents. But not the Ors. The Ors Nemesis ships can launch crew out as special infiltration units, which can board enemy ships and kill crew members from the inside, and the shields on the Terminators cannot block these attacks. Coupled with the tiny shots that Terminators normally shoot, which are nearly impossible to hit the infiltration units with, this made the Terminators a very poor choice to use against the Nemesis ships. This brings us to the Peconic Fury ships, which are interesting. They're normally pretty weak ships, which have to throw insults at opponents to regenerate spent energy, yet every time they're destroyed, there's a random chance they might be resurrected with a full crew complement. This kind of made the Fury ships a wild card for calculating the results, but at the same time, I'd like to think over the course of a minimum of 120 rounds of combat, this would even out in some way, and that the results wouldn't be too far off the mark. But that's something to keep in mind, is that the results for the Peconic Fury ships will probably be the least accurate because of this factor. Though interestingly enough, this resurrection ability made the Peconic Fury a notably bad choice against the Siren Penetrators. The Siren are able to invoke a siren call from their ship, which is short-ranged, but wills some of the crew of the opposing ship to eject outwards towards the Siren to be picked up and become new crew members. Suffice to say, every time a Peconic Fury resurrected, it just ended up becoming more crew members for the Siren Penetrator to keep alive and well. The Shafixty Scouts are also kind of tricky to measure, as, for better or worse, they were designed to resemble Japanese kamikaze pilots, and even given names playing off of that. And I also notice this is another game which confuses the Japanese phrase bonsai with bonsai. But let's not get into that. The thing is, how do you properly balance a ship designed specifically to detonate near an opponent, causing massive damage? But then I remembered that we're measuring things over the course of multiple fights, and I noticed the AI would keep a Shafixty Scout alive as long as possible if it felt they had a chance of survival. So ultimately, I decided to measure their success the same as any other ship. This was actually the point in time when I fully realized that measuring by wins wasn't going to cut it. If I wanted a proper, useful table of data, I needed to gauge success differently. And so I came up with a much more useful measure that would be based on the data that I was already collecting and tied in with something I was noticing from watching all of these battles, as they'd often play out in one of three ways. Either one opponent would consistently annihilate the other, one opponent would have the upper hand but would often take damage in the process, or the two opponents would be very well balanced, often with long drawn-out fights, and would trade kills with each other the whole way through. To that end, I came up with a grading system that would tie in with the results I was getting and the method I was using to measure all of this. If after a full bout of combat, one fleet was still fully stocked or missing only a single ship, they'd get an A ranking while the opponent would get an F. If the winning fleet was down 2 or 3 ships, they'd get a B rank with the opponent getting a D rank. Or if only a single ship remained, or both sides mutually decimated each other, they'd both get a C rank. Still, since this tied in with the data I was already collecting, I continued the fights as planned. Besides, by this point I was already well past the 3/4 mark and didn't have many fights to go. But there were 3 in particular I was dreading because I was worried as to how long they would take, and they all involved every combination of Unga Drone, Utwig Jugger, and Yeehaw Terminator. The Jugger versus Terminator is kind of a no-brainer as to why I was dreading it, because those two ships both have a means of becoming invulnerable to attack, so I was a bit worried the fight would go on forever. And my fears weren't completely unfounded, though due to the nature of the AI, they did eventually trade kills until finally only a single Terminator was left alive. The Unga Drone, however, has a special antimatter cone as its main method of attack. The problem here is that it blocks enemy attacks, but with enemies that can make themselves invulnerable, how would anyone do any damage to anyone? Well, the answer is, not easily. These battles also lasted an insane amount of time. However, in both cases, the Unga drones ultimately lost out. Now, just as one final point of curiosity before getting to the results of all of this, the 2 ships which had the hardest time doing much of anything to anyone were the Thradish Torch and Zogfot Pick Stingers. Now, both ships have very small crew complements and a very weak attack, with the Torch's special ability being to leave trails of fire, which are definitely powerful but very easy to dodge, while the Stinger has an exceptionally powerful tongue attack. But this attack has extremely limited range and a delay when used. Plus, when 2 ships collide, they bounce off of each other, so actually hitting anything with the tongue attack is incredibly difficult. Nevertheless, when it came time for these 2 races to duke it out, the winner was the Zogfot Pick Stinger. Not a shutout, but they definitely had the advantage. So, after this immense set of battles was finally over with, I ended up with this table of results. Now again, this is counting total kills in battles of 5 versus 5 of the same ships. And looking at these results, they really don't tell us the things we really want to know, which is not only how balanced these ships truly are, but the most intriguing piece of information would be which ships work better or worse against which ships. Well, knowing what to use against what could make the single-player experience far more manageable, as you know what to build and keep in your fleet given where you're going and what you're going up against. Thus, using the rankings I described earlier, and after spending a couple hours polishing the result into a full-page spread at typical printer resolution, this was the result. I'll have a link in the video description to download this image at full size and full resolution for everyone interested, but let's go over how to put this table to good use. The ships listed down the left side are the attacking ships, and ships listed across the top are the defending ships. Now choose the ship you're attacking with and follow down their row to the defender that you're going to be up against, and the rank will give you a general idea of how the battle will go. A rank means the attacker has a serious advantage, and that so long as you know what you're doing, you're probably going to win. B rank means the attacker has somewhat of an advantage, but the battle's not a shoo-in by any means, so you still gotta put up a decent fight. C rank means both ships have an even shot at victory, so you gotta fight really hard to win. D rank means your attacking ship is at a disadvantage, and that while you could still win, it's gonna be an extraordinarily difficult fight. While an F rank pretty much means your attacking ship is doomed and has little to no chance of success. But now here comes the more interesting part. As you can see, I marked in all of the point values from the Super Melee mode into the side. However, I decided to compile my own point ratings, where A is worth 4 points, B is worth 3, C 2, D 1, and F 0, and then add it all up, divide by 3, and round the result down. This created a brand new list of values, which are actually very intriguing. For starters, even though virtually none of these results are the same, save for the avatar, many of them are similar enough to suggest that the devs and testers behind Star Control 2 put a lot of work into getting these values as accurate as they could. Plus, they probably would have tested the human component a bit more thoroughly than I did. But there are definitely some big deviations here as well. For starters, the Androsynth Guardian, Ilrath Avenger, and Utwig Jugger are all considerably more powerful ships than their Super Melee point values suggest, while the 3 ships which took the biggest hits to their point values were the Peconic Fury, the Thradish Torch, and the biggest point loss, going from 16 to 9, was the Supox Blade. And yeah, the blade's reverse thrust makes it the most maneuverable of all, but that doesn't negate how weak its weapons and crew complement is, which led to a lot of death and even matchups with only a handful of decent fights. The Irquan Dreadnought and Korra Marauder also took 5-point hits to their ratings. Despite how powerful these ships are, they both had chinks in their armor, which made them a bit easier to take down over the stretch of multiple rounds of combat. Plus, neither of them could stand up to the awesome might of the Avatar. The last thing I should say about this table is I may have made a couple minor mistakes here or there, as I noticed a couple while checking over the data a second and even a third time to make sure I had it all correct. There's a massive amount of data here, and I'm just one guy, so it stands to reason I may have put in like the wrong number or something, or mathed something out wrong. If you do find a discrepancy in these results, feel free to let me know so that I can correct it. But do bear in mind, I was testing with the actual Star Control 2 Super Melee mode. If you're using the Irquan Masters port, there may be very tiny differences which could produce different results, although as far as I'm aware, the port uses the same point values for the ships as in Star Control 2 itself. Anywho, that'll be all for this week's ADG Pro. Next week's a filler, and I'm going to be taking a comparative look at a particular version of DOSBox a bunch of people have been on my case to look into to see how it fares compared to DOSBox 0.74 itself. Now, I've been told by one of the devs that DOSBox 0.75 is finally nearing release after all these years, so I plan to give it the same treatment with the same comparisons in the future, but I feel that should get its own video, so we'll get to that one down the road and do this initial comparison first, so make sure to stay tuned for it. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small set of you guys.